Why do I need to confess my sins to a priest?
Where is purgatory in the Bible?
What's stopping you?
I think the Pope has too much authority.
What's stopping you? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Hey everybody, welcome again to Call to Communion here on EWTN. This is the program for our non-Catholic brothers and sisters. If you've got a question about the Catholic faith, maybe you're a little confused about what the Catholic faith actually teaches on a given subject, we can help you with that. Here's our phone number, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. If you're listening outside of North America, please dial the U.S. country code and then 205-271-2985. Now, if you are watching us on TV today, you may want to shoot us an email. That would be a great way for you to get in touch with the show. The address, ctc@ewtn.com, ctc@ewtn.com. Charles Beery is our producer. Matt Kabinski is our phone screener. Jeff Burson handles social media for us. If you want to ask a question via YouTube or Facebook, we are streaming there right now. Just put your question in the comments box. Jeff will see it. He'll send it to us here in the studio, and we will take it from there. I'm Tom Price along with Dr. David Anders.
Tom, how are you today?
Doing great. How are you, sir?
Oh, I'm doing pretty well. Thank you so much.
Glad to hear that. We have an interesting email here from Peggy. Peggy says, my 13-year-old granddaughter argues with me that it's too hard to be a Catholic. She is not brought to church on a regular basis. She and my grandson would call me when they wanted to go to confession so that I could bring them. I tell them they need to go to church on Sunday, but their mother, who is married to a non-practicing Methodist, doesn't bring them very often. What more can I help them with?
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the question. So, is it hard to be a Catholic? I'd like to speak to that question at the outset.
It ain't for wimps.
Well, there's a sense in which it's extremely difficult,
Yes.
and there's a sense in which it's not. But I don't think that either of those is what the questioner has in view, right? Sounds like the grandchildren, for them, the hard part of being Catholic is making it to Mass on Sunday.
Yes.
It's the fact that they have a Sunday obligation. They regard that as hard. I don't think that's all that hard. And I imagine that if I parsed the hours in their week, I would find that those grandchildren had plenty of time, hours and hours on end, to give themselves to all kinds of activities other than Mass that they don't regard as burdensome. Right. In fact, a friend of mine shared a reading from St. John Chrysostom, who is, of course, recently, who is a 4th century doctor of the church, former patriarch of Constantinople.
Mm-hmm.
And he said way back in the 4th century, people find it hard to find the time to come to Mass when it's raining or the weather is inclement, but they have no trouble running to see the chariot races. It's not a new problem, So I don't really think that's the hard part of being a Catholic. The hard part of being a Catholic is trying to live the moral life that Christ calls us to, right? And having to do the work of genuine humility and self-examination to confront the things that you really need to change about your character. That's the hard part of being a Catholic. But it's also the beautiful part of being a Catholic because, look, think about how much our culture spends on beauty products and self-improvement, self-help books, gym memberships. I mean, the cult of the body, cult of the Instagram profile.
Mm-hmm.
People spend enormous amounts of energy to curate and cultivate and sculpt the perfect look, and they're willing to invest heavily in that. It's difficult, but you're gratified by the payoff. You like to step on the scale and weigh less and look in the mirror and like what you see. And the same thing is true in the spiritual life. When you take the time and the effort to curate and sculpt your interior life and character, happiness is the fruit. Happiness is the result because you gain balance and control over your emotional life. You're not tossed hither and thither by every wind of passion that comes your way. You're able to make good decisions about what to do with your life and how to give yourself to things of value and purpose and meaning. And the payoff is eternal, but also temporal. Even in this life, we have great satisfaction. So what can you help your grandchildren with? That kind of vision of the Catholic faith, where the question of the difficulty or inconvenience of Mass obligation pales in comparison to the value of a character conformed to the image of Christ and to the view of holiness and virtue, or being your best self, if you will, if you want to put it in secular terms, where their whole lives can be transfused with meaning, significance, and purpose.
Peggy, thanks so much for your email. Thanks also for being a good grandmother. God bless you for that. Here's an email that I don't think we've ever answered anything like this. This is from James. What is the Catholic Church's view on dreams and using them as guides in our daily life? If you have an interaction with a saint or even Jesus himself in your dream, how should we understand that encounter?
Yeah, I really appreciate the question. So the Church does not have a specific teaching on dreams, except to say that the Church believes that the nature of the soul is something that is open to scientific and philosophical investigation. And the Church is in no way the enemy of reason, of science, or philosophy. On the contrary, she thinks that reason and faith are collaborative, cooperating modes of being. And so anything that we discover rationally about our own lives, our own selves, is fair game, it's fodder for the work of being Catholic. And so, I think there's a great deal of psychological study, analysis, dreams, their significance, where they come from, the kinds of subconscious processes that produce them. And I think most of that has a naturalistic explanation, and we should see it as evidence of like memory formation and where our thoughts have been recently and what our own subconscious desires are at that particular point. So that doesn't necessarily have any revelatory significance, except as it reveals what's going on inside of us. Right? Now, that might have some value if you are dreaming something. I mean, I remember when I was before my father got sick, I used to have this recurrent nightmare that he died. And then once he had a stroke, a massive stroke, and was like in danger of death. I never had the nightmare that he would die ever again.
Really?
Yeah, it was like when he was in good health, I was terrified that he was going to fall into ill health. And it really created a lot of anxiety for me. Once he actually fell into ill health, like the thing I had been afraid of was happening, and I no longer had the nightmare. So what did I learn from that? I learned that this was a deep-seated fear that I have. Now, there are saints in history to whom God has sent private revelation in the form of dreams. We just submit that kind of thing to the judgment of the Church.
Sounds good to me. James, thanks so much for your email. In a moment, we'll get to the phones here at 833-288-EWTN if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. 833-288-3986 for Call to Communion.
Are you prepared to vote?
We as citizens do have co-responsibility for each other, for society, and this duty especially obliges those in a democracy who must elect representatives to run the state on their behalf.
Learn more so you're prepared when you vote this November. Visit EWTN.com/vote for everything Catholic voters need to know before picking up a ballot.
Hi, I'm Doug Keck. This is an EWTN Bookmark Brief, speaking with my co-worker, Michelle Johnson, about her book, Walking the Way of the Cross for Caregivers, How to Cope Practically and Spiritually When a Loved One is Seriously Ill. Michelle, what's this book about? Why did you decide to write it?
Well, the book takes readers through our 8-year journey, through 3 bouts of cancer, the amputation of my husband's leg up to the hip, and his resulting paralysis. He became a quadriplegic. But I group it all under Stations of the Cross. It was walking the way of the cross. We really were walking the way of the cross. And I want people to see and be able to compare what they're going through with Jesus' walk to Calvary.
Walking the Way of the Cross for Caregivers, How to Cope Practically and Spiritually When a Loved One is Seriously Ill. It's available through our EWTN Religious Catalog, EWTNRC.com. I'm Doug Keck. This has been a Bookmark Brief. Thanks for stopping by.
It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin today with Janice, a first-time caller in Danville, Virginia, listening on Sirius XM Channel 130. Hey there, Janice. What's on your mind today?
I'm a recently converted Catholic, but my family members still attend a Protestant church that has recently decided that they will recognize gay marriage. And there was a lot of reasons for it. There was a handout with a lot of reasons. But one of them I'm curious about is they said Jesus never mentioned homosexuality in his teachings, so it wasn't a concern. So I'm asking so I can tell my family members what the Catholic Church says.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate the question. So
You never mentioned TikTok either, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say that the criterion, Jesus never mentioned it, is an absolutely, pardon me for being so blunt, that is the most absurd thing I have ever heard in my entire life. I mean, Jesus never specifically mentioned methamphetamine or cocaine or intravenous heroin. He never mentioned nuclear weapons or child pornography or chattel slavery or genocide or Nazism. I mean, the list of things that Jesus never mentioned is infinite.
Yeah.
And to make the argument that Jesus not mentioning something makes it morally irrelevant or moreover praiseworthy is just the most manifest piece of moral absurdity that I have ever heard in my entire life. It would justify literally everything. Yeah. So it's just insanity. That's just not how you think about moral questions, right? And if you applied that reasoning to any of the moral shibboleths of this community, I think they would all wither under that criterion, right? This is just worthless polemics, worthless rhetoric on their part. So that means absolutely nothing, and it's false. Even if it were true, it would be absurd. But it's false that Jesus never mentioned homosexuality. Jesus absolutely gave explicit teaching on the nature of sexual morality. Explicit teaching on the nature of sexual morality. You find it in the Gospel of Matthew chapter 19. Now, the context was a question about divorce. Divorce. Whether a man can divorce his wife for any reason. And Jesus said, no, he cannot. The Pharisees asked, why does the law of Moses permit civil divorce? And Jesus said, because of the hardness of your heart. But it wasn't like this from the beginning. So he sets up a criterion, and that is what was from the beginning, and he means at the creation.
Yeah.
God made them male and female, so the man could cling to his wife, and the two would become one flesh. And what God has joined together, and to be fruitful and multiply. And what God has joined together, man cannot separate. So Christ conjoined the indissolubility of marriage for the purpose of procreation to the male-female procreative union as the normative pattern for all human sexuality. And exceptions to that rule were ruled out because they did not fit that normative pattern. That is explicitly Jesus' teaching. Now, he also speaks in multiple places about purity of heart, as being the goal of human sexuality, and lust as being the contrary vice that would exclude one potentially from the kingdom of heaven. And when you read in the larger New Testament context, purity refers very often to the question of sexual purity. And when you do the elaboration in the rest of the Pauline epistles, it's quite clear that impurity, sexual impurity, definitely includes, from St. Paul's perspective, homosexual relations. Right? Now, so all that is the case. But that's not where I'm going to leave you. I'm going to give you a lot more. Here is the fundamental problem with the so-called gay marriage debate in our civil society. And it's not whether Jesus mentioned it, right? It's not whether the traditional view is mean to gay people, or any of that, all right? All that's irrelevant.
Yeah.
The fundamental question is, why is there an institution called marriage? And not in Christian society, in any society. If you go to examine maybe Theravadan Buddhist culture from the 2nd century A.D. in Sri Lanka, never heard of Jesus, they're going to have marriage. If you look at Vedic Hinduism, never heard of Jesus, they're going to have marriage. If you look into traditional African society, They don't know anything about Jesus. They know about marriage. Inuit society at the North Pole. No Jesus. Lots of polar bears. And marriage. You know, like wherever you go in the world, there are only one or two historical examples from all of the cultures of the world throughout all of history that don't have something that corresponds to our understanding of marriage, meaning the union of a man and a woman for the sake of raising a family. Now, sometimes you'll find polygamy, you find matriarchal societies or patriarchal societies. You're going to find variations within the theme, but you're going to find the common element of a man and a woman together in some form of union for the purpose of raising a family and granting legitimacy and care to the offspring of that particular union. That's the common factor that you're going to find in all of these cultures. Why is there such an institution? Now, there are a lot of kind of social couplings that people have practiced throughout the centuries that no culture has ever sought to deem worthy or equivalent or in need of the same kind of legal or social protections as they do the male-female procreative union. So, for example, in ancient Greece, pederasty, that is the sexual union of an older man and a younger boy, was a highly valued social institution. And when you read the works of Plato, Plato makes reference to pederasty in just about every dialogue, all the time, constantly. It's constantly in your face when you're reading Plato. And the Greeks thought it was a good thing. They valued it. They thought that young kids could, this is absurd to me, but they thought, young men could learn something from their older lovers, and it was approved of, and Plato writes about it, and the Greeks approved it more or less, with some few exceptions. And yet, even though they had a high view of homosexual relations, even what we would consider to be child sexual abuse, and today would be prosecuted even in the most liberal parts of American culture, they never thought to call that marriage. They weren't prejudiced against homosexuals. In fact, they were a deeply misogynistic culture, and they thought that male homoerotic unions were more noble than the union of a man and a woman. So it implied absolutely no prejudice against homosexuality at all. And yet they never considered that union should be dignified in the way that marriage was. Today, I don't know, I think people really appreciate the union of that they have with their online video game partners. And for some people, that may be their primary social relation. Now, what I'm getting ready to say may be gainsayed in a moment, given the course of our civilization. But up until recently, no one has thought that we needed a Supreme Court case to determine whether or not we should dignify your multiplayer online role-playing video game with the privileges and dignities of marriage. Should you and your multiple online video game players be able to enter into a legal union that entitled them, say, to the adoption of children and to frontline consideration for those kinds of roles in society, just in virtue of playing video games together? No. Now, the question is, why not? Why didn't the Greeks think that pederasty was the same thing as marriage? Why don't we think that tennis playing is the same thing as marriage, or multiple online role-playing games are the same thing as marriage? Why this union in particular? And, if you live in most places of the country, it is falling off a log easy to understand the answer. It's because only the union of the man and the woman has the capacity to bring forth new life. It is the procreative aspect of the male-female union that makes it where new people come from. This is what you do to replenish society. Now, all but the most pathological societies, and we're quickly becoming a pathological society, all but the most pathological societies recognize we need to produce offspring if we're going to continue as a civilization. Now, there is a profoundly misanthropic vein that runs through our contemporary Western culture that does not want to perpetuate the species, that wants to eliminate the human race, that hates civilization and wants it to die. And they speak openly about this, right? But barring that pathological position, most people recognize culture has an interest in preserving civilization. We need new people. And we don't want pathological people. We don't want psychopaths. We want people that have been raised and nurtured to become good citizens. That means they have to acquire the virtues. They have to acquire self-control. They have to have some kind of education. They need to be loved and cared for. Now let's think, who's in the best position to do that? I know, we'll farm these kids out to the online video game community. That's who will raise them. Wrong. Wrong. Even the Greeks didn't think that the pederastic union was where kids should be raised, by and large. Okay? A few exceptions to that as well. But by and large, the people who are best suited to actually do the raising of the kids and caring for them are the people who were responsible for bringing them into the world.
Of course.
And who would that be? Who would that be? The parents.
Mm-hmm.
One man, one woman. That's how they got there. And so this has nothing to do with prejudice. This has nothing to do with Christian bigotry. That has nothing to do with divine revelation. This has to do with nature. The reason there is such a union called marriage is because of the blindingly obvious fact that when men and women get into intimate union, babies tend to happen. And because of society's interest in preserving itself and replenishing itself and raising new citizens, every culture on the planet has hallowed and sanctified marriage as a special kind of union. Not because they hate gay people, not because they hate trans people, not because they hate tennis players or role-playing games, but because we have a particular interest in replenishing society. Now, what's gone wrong is that Americans and Westerners have forgotten why marriage exists. Contraception has a lot to do with this because it's made us forget why we have sexual faculties. Mm-hmm. And they have come to think, they've come to believe the very modern and very romantic lie that marriage exists to gratify either my erotic attraction or my sense of romance. And that marriage is there to establish me in a kind of friendship with my perfect life partner who is destined for me from all eternity, Yahoo, right? The subject of the romantic comedy film. They think that's what marriage is for. And therefore, if that's what it's for, what we're dignifying is not our capacity to procreate, our capacity to bear children and raise them, but what we're dignifying is the most adolescent form of emotionality. Namely, what is it that tickles my boat? Or floats my, wrong metaphor. Floats my boat,
yes,
right? What is it that floats my boat, right? Either romantically or erotically. And that is, of course, fleeting and changing.
Yeah.
And wispy and sure to fail. Mm-hmm. Which is why as soon as the romantic notion of marriage took hold in civilization, no-fault divorce went out the roof.
Sure did.
And so opposing gay marriage at the civil level is not out of hatred for gay people. It's out of a deep desire to preserve the welfare of kids and recognize that the people who brought them into the world are the ones who have the obligation to take care of them, and we should help them do that. So I want to give you a book to read. It's by Robert George, person philosopher Robert George. Title of the book is Conjugal Union. Conjugal Union by Robert George. Good philosophical defense of the position that I just articulated.
Janice, thank you so much for your call, and that opens up a line for you right now at 833-288-EWTN. Looks like 3 lines open at the moment, 833-288-3986. Just heard from Derek in Uganda, listening today on YouTube. Derek says, where did the Catholic belief or need for godparents during baptism come from?
Sure, appreciate the question. So in antiquity, when most converts to the Catholic faith would have been adults, the form of initiation to the Catholic faith was that you first initiated the inquirer into the moral demands of the Catholic life, which were understood to be rather severe. Someone would have to give up a lot of things that they might have been practicing to become a Catholic. They'd have to give up idolatry. They'd have to give up sexual immorality. They'd have to give up greed. At one time, this is no longer the case. They would have to give up certain forms of social service. Like Christian soldiery is fine. You can be a Christian in the military, but when the military was engaging in all kinds of atrocities, you might not, right? And so you might have to give up your work as a soldier under particular circumstances. And if you weren't willing to make those commitments, you couldn't become a Catholic. And so it was necessary that people go through this period of moral purification and preparation, and that someone vouched for them before they were admitted into the community that was understood to be trying to live in a separated way that was distinct from the pagan world. These people they're with the program. They've made the commitments. They've shown themselves capable of living the commitments of the Catholic life. And so you had to have witnesses to bear witness to that. The godparent tradition is basically the heir to that. And because children, of course, are not in a position to be renouncing anything, right?
Right.
But it is the similar motivation, which is a commitment on the part of the godparents to assist in the raising of these children, to bear witness to the Catholic faith to them. so that they can understand the demands that are being placed upon them in Catholic life and live up to them.
You know that we are the proud godparents of 13. You know that.
Yes, I know this.
And not all those kids and now young adults, not all of them are in receive mode. But we've got to keep trying.
You do it. That's right. You
Absolutely. All right. And Derek, thank you so much for checking in from Uganda. That's why they call it the Global Catholic Network. In a moment, we're going to get to Denise in Cranford, New Jersey. Several lines open for you right now if you have a question for Dr. David Anders, or if you'd like to explain to us what is stopping you from becoming a Catholic. 833-288-EWTN is our phone number, 833-288-3986. Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders here on EWTN. Stay with us.
Someone asked me a question the other day. They said, Chris, if you can go back and talk to your 35-year-old self when your kids were a little younger and you were a little younger, what would you say? I said, you spend so much time and energy, Chris, when your kids are little, at building up that life you're dreaming of having, that ministry you're dreaming of having, that career you're dreaming of having, that it's easy to overlook the fact that life is already upon you. You're living it. You're in it right now. There's a great saying that life is what happens when you're making plans. Listen, it's necessary to make those plans and to strive in life. Don't get me wrong. It's necessary to work really hard if you're providing for a family, but don't get so lost in all that you forget that the dream you're working for is here, now, under your nose. Take the time to stop and enjoy it, or you miss out on the most important things in life. They're sitting around your table. They're in the car next to you as you listen to me on the radio right now. Soak it in. This is Chris Stefanik from RealLifeCatholic.com.
Want to be notified when Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders goes live on Facebook? Follow EWTN Radio's Facebook page and click the bell icon to be notified.
By providing quality programming faithful to the teachings of the Catholic Church, EWTN is television that viewers can trust. Whether it's films, documentaries, news coverage, lively discussion shows, or kids programs, we highlight the truth that is the eternal Word. For a complete schedule of EWTN television programs, visit EWTN.com and click TV. EWTN, the Global Catholic Network.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, we've got Trent Horn. Tips for defending your faith. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
Hey, what's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? Let's talk about that here on EWTN's Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders. Two lines open at the moment, 833-288-EWTN. That's 833-288-3986. Here's Denise now in Cranford, New Jersey, listening on the EWTN app, a free download, I might add. Hey, Denise, what's on your mind today?
Hi. So my son is suffering from depression. He's 19 years old. He's at college. And I mean, with that, what I'm doing is praying for him. But I feel, I don't know, I know that God is going to answer on his time. But meanwhile, I'm just waiting, looking at him now, going through psychiatric and asking for pills. And now, for first time, he's on pills. And I know what does that mean.
Sure. Thank you. I really appreciate the question. And listen, my heart goes out to you as a parent. I'm a parent of 5, and depression has struck my family, and I've personally suffered from depression, and I know how difficult it can be both to suffer this and also to try to live with and care for someone else who's suffering from it. So you really have my sympathy and a great deal of understanding, and I know you're in a difficult position, and you love your child, and you want to know how to help them, and maybe you don't know how, and that can be deeply frustrating. So I really, really do understand, and I really, really, really appreciate you, and thank you for your care for him. There are a lot of things that we can do and talk about when dealing with depression religiously. Depression is often, not always, but it's often the result of a sense of meaninglessness or alienation or being lost that is very common with 19-year-olds who leave and go to college. They're in a new environment. They're separated from their loved ones, from their friends from high school. Mm-hmm. The college experience is not well designed to create a sense of coherence or meaning. It's more like a buffet of everything, and a lot of it is drivel, and it doesn't seem to convey any sort of coherence or meaning or direction to your life. It's sort of on you to curate these various pieces into some sort of coherent pattern, and there's really no help from the university at all to do that. And everything ideologically about the university really undermines that path. So it's a time when a lot of young people have a crisis of depression, and their peers, to deal with that, often turn to very unhealthy behaviors. They turn to sexual escapades, drugs and alcohol, heavy video game use, lots of media, ideological factions and ideological possession of one kind or another. So their ways of coping are deeply maladaptive, and so it really is a kind of a tumultuous time to be a 19-year-old in college in the United States today. So it's understandable. Now, I think here's the path forward. So it's not bad that your son has psychiatric care. That's not bad. And look, I'm no psychiatrist. I'm not a doctor. I cannot give advice in that regard. But as a layperson who's read a lot of this literature, there is some value in antidepressant medication. It can help some people. But I also think that the data show, from what I understand, that you're better off doing that in conjunction with some form of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, where people learn to actually deal with their negative emotions and maybe dispute them and come to see their reality in a different light, where they can be a little bit more appreciative of what's going on, maybe not have to carry the weight so heavily as they do. So therapy is helpful. If you can get into Catholic Family Services or some form of Catholic therapy, I think that's even better. Sometimes with the secular therapists, you never quite know where they're going to send you. I wouldn't absolutely rule out that could be helpful, but I would look into maybe what Catholic Family Services or some Catholic counseling centers
maybe a little more focused.
Yeah, and Tom, don't we have some resources? Or we may not. Dr. Popchak, doesn't he have some places people can call?
He does. Also, Dr. Ray Garendi. I think they both participate in several ways, including online online counseling. That can be very, very helpful.
So listener
as well.
services probably have more detail on that, right? So
You
I would
better
call
believe
them
it.
for some resources on counseling. I would also really encourage your son to get involved socially. In the church as much as possible, but any kind of social involvement is usually very helpful in dealing with depression. I don't know if your college campus has a chapter of Focus, the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, small groups that get together and study Scripture and pray.
Fantastic.
And that kind of belonging really does go a long way towards helping with depression. I would say exercise. If he's just kind of sitting in his dorm room feeling down, there's a good research showing that just exercise by itself gets those endorphins flowing and can improve the neurotransmitters in the brain that regulate depression. So exercise is a helpful outlet. And then you may have limited ability to influence this at a distance, but if he wants to listen to this call, hear from somebody who was myself a depressed 19-year-old, and I know what he's going through, I would say by all means cancel every social media account. Just get off of Facebook, get off of Twitter, get off of Instagram, get off of all that stuff. And again, the data are pretty clear that the higher use of social media we have, the more depression goes up by and large, of course, across the culture. So just don't encourage them to get off of social media. Most movies and television these days is going to make you depressed. It may distract you from your depression for a few minutes, but it's going to fill your mind with stuff that's going to further destabilize you down the line. So healthy social outlets, healthy physical activity, healthy social connections, good therapy and counseling, good friends, and getting up and away from your computer screen and away from social media. All of these are things that we can do to help with depression.
And absolutely, Denise, keep up those prayers, right?
Yep, absolutely.
You better believe it. Denise, thanks so much for your call. Hope that's helpful for you and for him as well. Here is Jason now in Toledo, listening on the great Annunciation Radio. Hey, Jason, what's on your mind today, sir?
Hi, I've called in before and had a question. I'm a newer high school teacher, and juniors and seniors I teach, and struggling as I realize that high percentage of young men who are just making the claim of deism, and I'm trying to bridge that gap. And I've got resources, but looking for some bridges, some podcast things that will relate to these 17, 18-year-olds, because it's a little frustrating when I hear kids say they've been going to Catholic school for 12 years, they've heard it all, and they struggle with a personal God. So they describe themselves as deists. And
yeah, sure, absolutely. I really have a very good alternative for you. So a kid that goes from sort of traditional Catholic piety to deism in my judgment, never understood the Catholic doctrine of God to begin with. And I understand the move, like philosophically, or rather not philosophically. I understand the move existentially. I understand what would motivate someone to leave off Catholic, sort of traditional Catholic piety and move into what they understand to be deism, because the anthropomorphic God of their imagination that has so often been the subject, or perhaps I should say the object of their imagination when they engage in that piety, is the proverbial white man with a beard, sitting on the throne with thunderbolts. And even if they don't have that particular image in mind, they're relating to God, when they talk about it personally, to relate to God in a personal way or to have a personal relationship with God does not mean that we think that God is a person in the same way that we are persons. Right? So all of the kind of peculiar attributes of personality that we associate with humanity, the emotionality and the passing states of emotion and changes of thoughts and discursive reason and physical presence and the sort of punctuated interventions in historical moments, all those things that constitute human personal interaction, none of that really applies to God. And so in your life, when you begin to find out that reality is just a lot more vast than the rather truncated vision of God that you were relating to in your pious imagination in childhood, and the bubble bursts and you begin to feel maybe disoriented or somewhat disillusioned with that picture of God, and you've never been given an alternative. You only have the anthropomorphic God of childhood imagination, and the only alternative to that seems to be deism or atheism. Well, that's a very rational move, right? I mean, I get why someone would make that move. The problem with that is that they've never really encountered the Catholic doctrine of God, which is so much more profound than deism, which I consider to be like the philosophically sophomoric view of theism, right? Because deism is a mechanistic God who stands apart from his creation as an object, the way an artisan would stand apart from an artifact. He makes it and sets it up and then walks away from it. And one should see at a glance that is actually just as anthropomorphic and philosophically restrictive as the granddaddy God with the beard, right? Because how can the cause of all being step away from anything?
Yeah.
Right? You see what I'm saying? That,
Sure.
That deism sort of imagines that there's this space called reality in which there are at least two kinds of objects, God and then other stuff. But we both occupy the space called reality. And it sort of takes for granted that there is this thing called reality in which we both live, in which we both operate, God on his side and we on ours, without ever wrestling with the fact, well, where did the reality thing come from if God is just an object within it? But that's just not the way and that's why I say it's kind of anthropomorphic and a bit sophomoric to think of it that way. Yeah. But that's not the way Catholics think about God at all. Catholics, the technical definition of God is subsistent being. It's the very act of being itself. That's what we mean by God. And St. Paul put it well in Acts 17, God in whom we live, move, and have our being. St. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Contra Gentiles says in one place that God is virtually all things. God is virtually all things. What does that mean? Well, it's sort of like the relationship between the axioms of a proof to its conclusion. If you ever took geometry and you know how to reason from axioms and propositions to a geometric conclusion in a geometric proof, right? The conclusion is contained virtually within the axioms and the propositions. It has to be spelled out, but it's contained virtually within. St. Thomas says God is virtually all things. So you sort of see the nature of the analogy that he's drawing, right? That we talk about creation out of nothing, creation ex nihilo. But I think there's a real sense in which we could also talk about creation ex deo, right? In that we came out of nothing insofar as we didn't come out of some pre-existing matter. But we didn't come out of nothing insofar as we came out of God. And so in another place, Thomas uses the Neoplatonic language of emanation, that reality is an emanation. Reality as we experience, the temporal, changing, passable reality, is an emanation from the unchanging, eternal God. That's very Neoplatonic, right? But he does use that language in some places. And so our relationship to God is more like the relationship of, say, we talked about geometry earlier. Imagine if you've worked out the proof and you decide to diagram it out on a piece of paper. And then you imagine, well, what are the conditions that make that possible? I mean, how is it that I can actually diagram the proof out on paper? Well, there's this theoretical construct called a plane that necessarily exists at a theoretical level in order for me to conceptualize the proof. The plane is just the thing that makes the rest of geometry possible. It's that in virtue of which geometry can happen.
It's the OS.
Yeah, exactly. You know, well, in this analogy that I'm drawing, God is the plane. God is that makes the rest of everything possible to be. God is the condition of the world's intelligibility. And so, you know, how to convey this to young people, right? Well, one has to get clear on the doctrines oneself. And for that, I think, you know, some philosophical texts in Catholic philosophical theology would be helpful that really would undermine deism altogether. Nobody does a better job of this, I think, than Edward Feser.
Yes.
Right, so Feser's got a bunch of books. His book, The Last Superstition, his book on Aquinas, his blog, his philosopher's blog, Edward Feser Blogspot, is just a magnificent resource for philosophical reflection on questions like deism and philosophical theology. Magnificent book by the Orthodox theologian David Bentley Hart on the doctrine of God called The Experience of God. All of these would be great places to go. C.S. Lewis's essay, Transposition by C.S. Lewis. In fact, a lot of Lewis's nonfiction works, when he deals with the doctrine of God, are very understandable to an adolescent audience, but actually have quite a bit of philosophical depth.
All right. Well, that hopefully is helpful for you and your students, Jason. Thanks so much for your call today. Call to Communion here on EWTN. Be sure to join us for Women of Grace with John Ed Williams, Monday through Friday mornings at 11 a.m. Eastern. That also encores Tuesday through Saturday mornings, 3 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio. John Ed shows you how to embrace the Catholic life with joy and peace. Sounds good to me. Let's go back to the phones now here on EWTN's Call to Communion. And Ann is a first-time caller in northern Indiana, listening on the great Redeemer Radio. Ann, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Dr. Andrews, thanks for calling. For taking my call. Well, you were talking about same-sex unions, and I was hoping you would say this, but you didn't, so I'm going to ask the question. What happens, how do we justify man and woman being married when when they're past the age of childbearing? Or let's say one is sterile and they cannot reproduce.
Sure, absolutely. I appreciate it. Because the union of a man and a woman is the kind of union that would naturally be fulfilled in the bearing of children. Now, even if the union does not in fact succeed in producing children, like, I understand the kind of union that I'm engaging in. And I'm not just talking about the bodily aspect, right? I'm not just talking about the physical union, the sexual union of man and woman, although that's included. But there's an entire constitution of relationship. You understand, if you're a married person, you know what I'm talking about. That is like, you know, at a certain age, couples, you know, their sexual life is going to diminish as they get older. And yet you meet some, you know, 85-year-old married couple, man and woman, and like that husband is never going to confuse his wife with his golf partners. You know, she is never going to confuse her husband with, you know, the members of the women's altar sodality that she meets with, right? I mean, it's a different kind of union.
Right.
And it's the kind of union that is naturally fulfilled in the bearing of children. And even when through no fault of their own, maybe through sterility, you know, in an early age or just old age as they go through menopause and natural processes of life, you still understand what you're getting. And, you know, when I was a child, and you had the same experience, and I would go visit my grandparents, it was no stretch for me to grasp that my grandparents, who did not have small children running around, like their kids were grown, they were not bearing kids, that they were involved in the same kind of union that my parents had. That was obvious to me, right? Now, I mean, compare that to any other kind of union. Now, to single out homosexuality seems to me quite arbitrary. Why not pick tennis players?
Yeah.
If tennis is your thing, like, why not compare heterosexual union, sexual union and marriage to tennis playing? And then, would a child have the same response? If I go see my dad with his tennis partner, would I be in danger of confusing his union with his tennis partner with his union to my mother and think that they're really just the same thing? It's just the same kind of union. No, it's absurd.
Of course. There it is. Ann, thanks so much for your call. Here is Mike now, a first-time caller in Pennsylvania, listening on JMJ Catholic Radio. Hey there, Mike. What's on your mind today, sir?
I'm calling. A friend asked this of me, and I tried to explain to Dr. Anders, referring to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 to 18. And now I think he's got, well, I'll let you answer it. He's thinking and equating this with the fact of our eternal rest grant unto them, the prayer we often say for our deceased. They feel that these souls are kind of shelved, nowhere in the state of limbo, and that this chapter 4, verses 13 and 18 emphasizes that.
Sure. I totally. And so you want to understand the Catholic response to that position?
Absolutely.
I got you. Okay. Yeah, well, if all we had was 1 Corinthians 4, then I would believe in soul sleep. Right there. I mean, there's a position in historic Christianity. It's a minority position that the Church has ruled to be incorrect. Now it's heretical to hold it, called soul sleep or psychopanachia. And it holds that the dead sleep in the dust until they rise again to consciousness on the last day. And they point to verses like this, right? And if that's all you had, well, then that's what you'd hold, because Paul uses explicitly the language of sleep. He says they sleep in death until the Lord comes back. That's what he says. So if that's all you had, then you would conclude that, right? The problem is that's not all we have. That's not all we have. And it also makes the mistake of assuming that the way to do Catholic doctrine is to find some proof text from Scripture and exegete it. That's not how you do Catholic doctrine. The Scriptures weren't given to us to give us a comprehensive account of Christian doctrine. I mean, Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians for one specific reason. The church at Thessalonica expected the imminent return of Jesus. And Paul also expected the imminent return of Jesus. Now, it's been imminent now for 2,000 years, but they didn't know that at the time. Right. They were really looking for Christ to come back, probably contemporaneously within their lifetimes. And they understood that when Christ came back, they would go to join with him in glory. And so they were getting kind of worried about the folks that had died. Like, if they died, were they going to miss out on the parousia, on this second coming of Jesus? And so Paul writes to assuage their eschatological anxiety. Now, what the frame of reference is just entirely different from the way we're experiencing things today, because we know Christ is going to come back, but the church no longer has this expectation of an imminent parousia. Right, because it's been 2,000 years. Yeah. But at this period in history, they really were thinking in terms of, he's going to come at any second. And we will make sure everything's kosher when he gets here, so to speak. Excuse the pun there.
Yeah.
All right. And so that's what he's not really writing about, the condition of souls in death. It's really the psychological state of mind of those who are still alive in Thessalonica that he's trying to address. And he assures them, he says, know that we who are left, that are still alive, and left until the coming of the Lord, we will not precede those who have fallen asleep. For the Lord himself will come down from heaven with a loud command, and the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God, and the dead in Christ will rise. And then we who are still alive and are left will be caught up together with them in the clouds. All right? But that was the concern. Are we going to precede those who have fallen asleep in death? It wasn't about, hey, what's happened to these dead guys?
Yeah.
So how do we establish that the dead in Christ can actually see God in the beatific vision, albeit without their bodies? Well, Paul himself says in his Philippian correspondence that he prefers to depart and be with the Lord, which is far better than to remain in the body. The book of Revelation in chapter 4 depicts the souls of the dead crying out under the altar of God and asking to be clothed, which is a reference to the resurrection. In the book of 2 Maccabees, chapter 15, you have the prophet Jeremiah appearing to Judas Maccabeus in a dream and conveying private revelation to him that we're told is worthy of belief So, I mean, there's plenty of testimony from the Scriptures that the disembodied souls of the just are conscious and can, in fact, communicate to the living when God grants it. Right? But I recognize that those verses are obscure, and we find this kind of text in 1 Corinthians 4 on the other side, which is why there was a controversy in ancient Christianity over this question. Do the souls of the just sleep, or do they see God immediately in the beatific vision as they await the resurrection? And there actually was a pope, John the 22nd, who departed from Catholic tradition on this question, and he held for the doctrine of soul sleep. And it really upset the theologians in Paris. They wrote him a letter, and they said, you know, Pope, you're out to lunch on this one. You need to come back into align with Catholic tradition. And he eventually did. By the end of his life, he recanted his erroneous position, and he said, you know, I didn't teach it as a pope. I just held it as a private theologian. Now I understand that I was wrong on this. And then his successor, Benedict XII, wrote an encyclical. It was Benedictus Deus Est was the name of the encyclical, that defined the dogma that the souls of the just, in fact, do see God with the beatific vision before the resurrection.
All right, there you go, Mike. Appreciate your call. Let's go quickly to Bill in Boston, listening on the great Station of the Cross. Bill, what's on your mind today?
Hi, thank you guys for taking my call. I had two questions. First one is about a Bible recommendation. I love the Bible I have right now. Just reading in the footnotes, it's a revised version of the King James. It's possibly a Protestant Bible. I don't know. I wish I had it on me right now. But I like it. It's very accessible. But when I read through some of the Pauline letters, I kind of wonder if some of the language is not so much Catholic. So I was wondering if Dr. Anders might recommend a better accessible, I like a smaller one. Some of the Catholic ones are like 16 inches. They're big to carry around.
I recommend the New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition from Ignatius Press. That will check all of your boxes. You can get a thin leather-bound form of it, and it's an ecumenical translation. Protestant and Catholic scholars both worked on it, but a lot of Catholic scholars appreciate it, and I like it for readability and faithfulness to the underlying Greek and Hebrew. New Revised Standard Version Catholic Edition. I like the Ignatius Press version of that, which is a Catholic publisher. So that's what I would go to. And I think you had one other question.
His second question was he's looking for some resources for understanding the Blessed Sacrament.
Right. So I would, if you've never read the Catechism of the Catholic Church, I would start with the sections from the Catechism of the Catholic Church about the Blessed Sacrament. If that's not enough for you, you want more, you can come back and ask me. My favorite book on the Eucharist is The Key to the Doctrine of the Eucharist by Abbot Vonier, V-O-N-I-E-R. It's a little bit, more complicated from a theological point of view. So I'd start with the Catechism.
Very good. And Bill, thanks so much for your call. Couldn't get to Pamela watching on YouTube, but we're going to try to get to her in a future show. Also couldn't get to Angelina, Mary, or Marion. If you folks would call us back either tomorrow or next time that we're on the air, we'll be glad to put you at the head of the line. Dr. David Anders, thank you, sir.
Tom, thank you so much.
We do this program Monday through Friday on EWTN Radio. Be sure to tune in 2 p.m. Eastern for our live broadcast. On behalf of Dr. David Anders and our great team here, I'm Tom Price. We will see you next time here on EWTN's Call to Communion. Have a great day and God bless.
Cresta in the Afternoon presents the truth of the Catholic faith. In the light of that faith, we analyze our culture's ideas, trends,